Welcome back to the Student Hub Live. This session is all about postgraduate study in education and youth. And I'm joined by Jane Cullen and Alison Fox. And we have a video from Heather Montgomery after this session who can't join us now. But we're going to talk about postgraduate study. Now, many students will have studied undergraduate study with the Open University, but we get a lot of students who come to us without knowing a thing about the Open University. So what I was hoping to do was cover how postgraduate study worked and also fill in those students as well about our particular model of education. Now, Jane, you're the lead for the Masters in Education and Masters in Childhood and Youth, and you specialise in leadership and management here. And Alison, you're the lead for the teaching and learning pathway. So you're both experts at giving our students a good start. Now, first, if I can talk about the difference between postgraduate and undergraduate study. I mean, some students will just transition between the two, but they are fundamentally different. What would you say the main difference is?
That's a really good question, Karen. I think as you're suggesting, then sometimes the differences are not sharp, that undergraduate students have been becoming ready to start postgraduate study as they're finishing their undergraduate degree. But for some, it can be because of a break in study for a number of years, because for some, they can find that postgraduate study is quite fundamentally different. I think one of the things is that we assume that you, a postgraduate student beginning your study, have a fair amount of experience in terms of study skills. In other words, you come in with a first degree and therefore you've had that experience of studying in higher education over an extended period of time. So that's the first thing. And then I think the second thing, which is fundamentally different and which some students, not all students, find challenging, is that postgraduate study requires increasingly a measure of independent study, and really that kind of independent study and frankly the kind of individual expertise that a student is building up increases as the student gets further and further into their postgraduate degree. I think there are some other things which perhaps go with the territory, that students who are studying at postgraduate level are very often a ways into their career. It can mean, and again, generalising, it can mean that they're already in posts of responsibility in the particular aspect of the particular strand of the educational profession that they're involved in. And therefore it can mean that time is really at a premium. It can mean that they've got professional responsibilities, but also it can be that they've got caring responsibilities which are perhaps greater than they had when they were an undergraduate. So I think that's another difference. I think that, and one of the things in those kinds of situations is that it can initially sometimes be difficult for postgraduate students to allocate and rationalise the time that they need for postgraduate study. It is intensive. Our postgraduate courses, we always say it requires study of 15 hours a week and upwards, and that's quite a heavy chunk to find out of a week. And I think one of the things that we do recommend to students or suggest to students is that they do find some strategies for how they allocate that kind of time. I mean, it can mean some negotiation with family, for example, around times in the week when mum or dad is not going to be available, spaces in the house, for example, where that can be set aside for that kind of study, so that there's kind of a number of things that are important for setting up you as a postgraduate student beginning your postgraduate study, and they're all things to think about. I think postgraduate students as well can be in mid-career, and so they can be thinking about their next career steps. We tend to find that students are pretty settled in the career that they've chosen, but it might be around ideas about promotion or greater responsibility that they're looking for, and their postgraduate study will be part of that kind of aspiration and ambition, and some of what they're doing in their study will be those kinds of transferable skills that they'll take with them.
So some people are doing things that are sort of aligned with perhaps their current profession or their future profession. They're very busy. Our next session is going to focus on critical thinking, and there's this idea that, you know, as students progress throughout their careers as students, that they have to do more and more and more thinking. And this strikes me as a challenge in postgraduate studies, in particular if you are in a setting and you do have to do a lot of thinking and you're very, very busy, and factoring in that time to reflect on what you need to is perhaps one of those things that's difficult to prioritise.
I think that's true, and I think that for all students, that idea of prioritising your study and study at a deeper intensity and as it were, critical reflection and critical thinking is something that's difficult to prioritise. But students do find ways in which to do that. I think that's the encouragement, you know, and I'd say to all of you who are starting postgraduate study that it can be a bit scary at first, and it can seem at a higher level at first, but you know, postgraduate students, you do find your feet.
And one of the things that I've just done on the Facebook group at the moment is ask people to, or suggested people that they might want to put their, as they start the programme, you know, what they really want to get out of it and why, you know, they're passionate, you know, this moment you're really excited about joining. Put it in an envelope and then review that at Christmas, at Easter breaks. Just come back to that sort of drive and also recognise the changes in what you might want out of it as you go through the programme.
So being very mindful of that goal and your own individual priorities with what you're doing. Now, PDP is one of these things that is very, very important, so personal professional development, and we really encourage it at the Open University. What is it and how does it support students?
Well, picking up on what Jane's just said, it's a way of thinking about your journey through anything, but you know, obviously we're embedding it through our master's programmes. So the professional or personal development planning is a sort of set of skills. So we've got some documents that help sort of chart the sorts of skills that personally, academically and professionally you'll be developing throughout the programme, and then setting a sort of process for you to sort of set goals, review your skills, your confidence levels, to chart your progress through the programme, and also start to be very explicit about the benefits that Jane was talking about to you personally, to your career development, in new areas of interest, where that might take you, but also, you know, to some of the benefits real time during the course.
Okay, so let's break this down. What do the personal skills cover then?
So the personal skills, just as Jane was saying, are really making you step back and think about, you know, on your study skills and your digital information literacy skills, and we've got a library session afterwards that will be really helpful in thinking about that, and really making sure that you've thought through and experimented with some different ways. Again, on the Facebook site we've had a really good discussion, certainly at the beginning of last year, about people were sharing experiences of where they study, and it might be the back of a car, it might be a study snug space, but actually over fitting it in your life, you might have to try some different things, and so talking to other people is really helpful about thinking about that. And so work-life balance, time management, all the things that Jane was talking about. So we've got an explicit strand where you recognise that as part of managing the busyness of working and studying as a postgraduate.
Okay, now the second area you mentioned were the academic skills, and you can see how these would be incredibly evident and important. What skills are developed then? Okay,
well, I think it's embodied in a term that I already used, and it's a term that we use all the time, and it sounds easy, but actually I think it's quite hard, and that's critical thinking. And the idea of this, I suppose, is that at postgraduate level, I think, as I was saying earlier, then you, the student, are beginning to develop academic expertise, so individual expertise, you know, particularly in a topic, because the kind of topics that you'll be working on as postgraduate students are aligned to your own professional interests. So, in other words, you're in effect in postgraduate study going on a journey which where your study is and your professional interests are going together, and you're asking questions about your organisation, for example, your professional experience, that you're starting to interrogate ways of doing or ways of organising in your own workplace. And over the course of the Masters in Education, which the students are just beginning, then by the end of it you will have carried out a piece of practical inquiry, which is a significant piece of work, which is based on your own organisation and your own professional practice. And so this idea of critical thinking is critiquing, is starting to interrogate, is starting to question perhaps what have been assumed practices or assumed attitudes or assumed ways of doing things in your workplace or in your organisation. And so it's critical thinking, and it's critical writing, and it's critical reading. And as I was saying before, these aren't necessarily things that have not been happening at undergraduate level, but at postgraduate level they become incredibly important. And this development of criticality is, I think, what separates out postgraduate study and really starts to enable students to see themselves as growing into members of the academic community and in a sense starting to become fully fledged academics. This idea of criticality, again, Alison was mentioning, we've got a session later on in the library. We've got a session on criticality, I think, which is going to come right after this session. And I'd urge those of you who can to watch this.
No, absolutely. We'll be talking all about that and also about library skills. Now, the third area you mentioned, Alison, were the professional skills. How are they developed?
Well, as Jane says, they are integrated into the course. So these are applied master's courses where you are be able to think about the content of whatever the pathway you've taken or the programme you're on, and reflect it into your real-time experience of professional work, as Jane's just been saying, re-examining that workplace. And therefore the benefits are not just for you in your building your knowledge, your application of theory into practice, but also to benefit those around you. And the whole notion of this personal professional development planning is to chart that progress, so to make it explicit rather than you coming on a course to learn some content, some stuff around a particular area. And so those personal skills and those professional skills are to help you as you go into the sorts of promotional cases or changes of direction of career, to give you an evidence base for why you've changed your thinking, how you've changed your thinking, how the Masters was valuable to your practice. And so that last sort of element of it is actually to be able to create some sort of stories that you can tell back in the workplace, or conversations to have in the workplace, and then to chart those into sort of portfolio of what you're getting out of the Masters.
Okay. Those are really big areas, and I wanted to talk about actual study because in addition, you talked about a community of scholars and a community of learners, and talking to people is very, very important at postgraduate level, as it is at undergraduate level. But it's important because I think people can then start to share ideas and also articulate things out loud, which might then prompt their own thinking. How might people then work with colleagues or critical friends doing a postgraduate?
Well, I think the idea of colleagues, working with colleagues is an essential part of postgraduate study, of the kind of postgraduate study that students are going to be starting. And I think, it is again this idea of the course, the Masters itself, and their professional experience being intertwined. So the idea of a critical friend, I think, is one which is really helpful, and that is, using colleagues at work as kind of sounding boards for the own question, the questions that you as a student are starting to ask about your professional experience, and as a result of your master's study, and in a sort of a more practical sense, then as you the student are going through the particular courses which make up the Masters, then those colleagues almost don't necessarily become just critical friends, but they become participants in your inquiry. Mm-hmm. And so it can end up being a really helpful collaborative effort on the part of obviously invested in the student themselves, but also in involving others in the organisation. I think there are other sets of people who are really important to you, the student. I mean, one of the important sets of people, I think we've already mentioned, are the family. I don't think anyone ever succeeds in any kind of study without the support of their family. But they can also be that kind of sounding board for change, for professional learning, for new ideas. I think peers, I think friends as well as family can also be important for exactly the same reason. But then we come to, I think, perhaps the most important person for any student at the Open University, and that's your tutor. Your tutor is your source of support, and I think working with tutors, we realise, and I think students who've worked at the OU realise how incredible and incredibly valuable they are as a source of support. They are not only founts of all wisdom, but they are generous with their time, they're generous with their knowledge. They're incredibly interested, I think, in this journey that any of you as postgraduate students make, and ready to help in any way possible.
Now, we have a question, if we may. Megan wants to start an MA in Childhood and Youth Studies, but she doesn't work in education at the moment. Is that going to be a barrier?
No, not necessarily. I think that's a good question, and I think just as an aside, but perhaps it's something that we'll repeat at the end, and that is there is a lot more information about the Masters in Childhood and Youth and the Masters in Education on the Masters subject website. So not just from the kind of the dialogue that we're having here right now, but from the website itself, and the video that Heather is going to be
we'll show, yeah.
We're going to show from Heather a bit later on. But the idea of the Masters in Childhood and Youth is that the Masters in Childhood and Youth is more concerned with children and child development, and so there isn't that imperative or that impetus for an educational setting of the kind that there is in the Masters in Education. As well, and what Heather is going to be talking about is that the new Childhood and Youth is going to be starting this October, and so that there are going to be options at the dissertation level which give students an opportunity to write a dissertation outside the kind of the idea of if students are in an educational setting, that's fine. It's not it's not one or the other, as it were. I mean, but it is that students don't necessarily need to have access to an educational setting for the Masters.
Now, you've mentioned your peers and your tutor, but there's also the student support team, and we have some specialists in postgraduate study. Now, they would be a good source of support for Megan to go to, wouldn't they?
Yeah. No, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes, no, and they're another sort of fantastic team of people. And I think, those of you who have been students at undergraduate level, as it were, how many teams and how many sources of support there are in the Open University, and this is another one. So student support can very often be that place to go to for those wider questions, for those questions that are perhaps outside the particular module that you're working on, that perhaps are complex questions which might have to do with wider questions about your needs as an individual student. So student support team, really excellent people.
What advice would you give, Alison, to somebody who was interested in doing something at postgraduate level but wasn't quite sure which pathway to go down? So say if Megan was thinking, well, I could do this or I could do that. What is it about postgraduate study that's so rewarding? And I guess what I'm leading to is ultimately might not end up where you suspect it will, in the sense of a named qualification or a named programme. The study of doing something at postgraduate, shifts so many boundaries, and often you can find different avenues that maybe you hadn't thought of exploring before.
I mean, there is some flexibility, and I know mostly about the MA in Education. There is some flexibility to take a stage 1 module, so the first year module, in the one that makes sense to you, when you've read the materials and perhaps you've spoken to the student support team, or then you can take the module that seems to fit best with you get most excited about. And then there's an option to change at that point after that module study into one of the other pathways. So if you start to have sort of thoughts and interests, that we've got spaces on the subject website, and we've got spaces, well, the Facebook community as well. We've got a Facebook closed group, would be the place to explore the other pathways and to sort of make some conversations about, you know, find out what they're about, and then you can move. And then the last 2 modules you would finish on that other pathway, and whichever pathway that was, you would be given the name of that.
So much like undergraduate study, you can start at one level and then branch into areas that you'd like to be more specific, which is great in terms of flexibility. So you can go for something and then change your mind if it doesn't suit. Now, you've mentioned the Facebook page and this being a great sense of support, but there are also private spaces as well that students will form support networks for in postgraduate study.
Well, there are student-formed groups we know of, but obviously they're student-formed groups.
They're very private. They won't let you in.
No, but I know they are very good for some people, and they often, you know, have debates around particular issues, and they are really, really supportive. I have actually had access to one of the student support groups, and have been sort of allowed in, and I've seen how people, particularly this particular module went into the summer, people were finding it really tough, and people were jolly each other along. So they are really helpful, and they just come out of those groups and ask us, you know, if there's things that they can't solve, you know, for themselves. There's also, I think, to add to what Jane was saying, there's lots of student spaces within the modules. You know, there's participation is built in with online forums and various different activities to offer that support, particularly in developing the critical thinking around the different subjects, to get that confidence in spaces with one another, moving together.
Now, we're doing a session later on the library and also critical thinking, and we've mentioned the student support team. But there's one thing I did want to ask you about, which is a postgraduate studies BOC, a badged open course. Now, this might be particularly relevant for students who perhaps haven't studied with the Open University, but actually the idea of succeeding in postgraduate studies is very broadly appealing. Why might students benefit then from spending extra time doing that?
Well, I managed to interview quite a few people from last year, and they all referred to this course, and not necessarily at the beginning. And I think it's this process of, you know, you can sort of evaluate your study skills, and you can evaluate what, you know, how you work. And it might have worked in a particular way on a particular undergraduate course or suited you in the past. But when you're being asked to do these sort of more demanding tasks, you can go into any part of it. So it covers critical thinking and reflective skills, and it covers, you know, it's a very well thought through that you can dip into course that whenever you are on your studies as a, you know, somewhere to go to. Yeah.
And we're putting a link to that in the chat for you, and if you're watching on Catch Up, then you can find that on the subject website as well. So, a lot of additional support for students. Just briefly covering the sort of learning and teaching pathway then. You've mentioned that there are modules and then you can branch into certain things. Where does the pathway start?
Well, it actually goes back to what you were just saying. This particular module starts with a badged open course, and we've tried to do that because the whole vision for this pathway is to reimagine the education that you think is fit for the future. So we wanted to engage with as many people from around the world as possible. We've had over 500 people on this badged open course. It's called Looking Globally, the Future of Education. And people are coming together, and unusually for an Open University badge course, it's an interactive one with forums, and we've got a Padlet wall, absolutely jammed packed with debate around what's needed for the future of education. And so that's where we're asking people to start our new pathway, and we're asking people to get the badge, because the badge will become part of the first assessment. Then they'll go into our module and be within this community of postgraduate students and tutors to have this richer debate filled with sort of stimuli and evidence, and asked to critique that and reevaluate your vision for education is the focus of the first module.
Jane, I also wanted to ask you about the new Masters in Childhood and Youth that we'd mentioned earlier as well. Very briefly, can you give us an overview of that?
Sure, and I mean, I think, you know, just like Alison has been talking about the new learning and teaching pathway, then we have been creating these new qualifications, these new pathways. And so the new Masters in Childhood and Youth starts this October with the first module, and that is the one that Heather will be talking about and talking to in a little while. But the idea is to make a more coherent approach to the Masters in Childhood and Youth. So rather like the Masters in Education, which has been established now for a couple of years, then the new Masters in Childhood and Youth takes students on a coherent journey through a stage 1, stage 2, stage 3 module with 2 modules, the first 2 modules with content, and then the final module focusing on a dissertation. So it's this idea, exactly the same idea of a coherent, structured progression of study where the student is developing their own expertise in the specialised field of study.
Perfect. Kieran is loving his master's modules. He says they're really well written, and Anne is loving the interactive global element. So that's really, really good to hear. We're going to hear from Heather now because unfortunately we're out of time, but in our next session we're going to take a look at critical thinking, which, as you've both said, is very, very important for students. So this next video is featuring Heather Montgomery, and then I'll be back with Jill Clifton to talk about critical thinking. We'll see you then.